we are going to start by talking about self-differentiated leadership, which is something that we talk about in year B in the college. I just want to show you really quickly so you remember this is what the model looks like. Remember this is a way of discerning as leaders how to differentiate our own stuff from our system's stuff, how to stay connected to our system emotionally while also being able to differentiate enough to set direction when we need to, and to manage resistance and sabotage. And also equally important is cultivating a self-regulated, non-reactive, and non-anxious presence. So we're gonna just kind of talk about how that's been an interesting challenge. At least I know it has for me as someone who's leading a congregation and also involved in diocesan leadership. And the goal for this conversation with Diana and with Anna is for all of us to be able to hear a few practitioners talk about how we've used this model and these concepts in this time. Whether it's been thinking about staying connected in a different way, thinking about setting direction in a different way, or managing that sabotage and resistance, which I know for me comes both from my system outside myself and from my own anxious reaction and reactivity to the situations in the world inside of myself. So I think I'm going to start by asking Anna, and we'll all three talk to each other, but asking Anna to talk a little bit. She brought up in a prior conversation this beautiful term, benevolent dictator, which resonated with me. I'm someone who prefers to stay connected, but found myself doing a lot of really firm direction setting in this first part. And Anna, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how this model has worked for you in your leadership as things have gone nutty where you are.
So I must confess that my go-to leadership style is probably benevolent dictator. I don't, some people love small group work. I kind of would much prefer to just be left on my own to do my own thing. And sometimes benevolent dictatorship is not the greatest leadership model, and there's situations where I need to work harder at connecting with people and work harder at consulting. But I found that in this situation, and Alissa was saying the same, and I've heard from others that actually, especially as we sort of hit the ground running when this first came out, that benevolent dictatorship was actually a useful form of leadership and was fairly well received. So there was very little resistance or sabotage to my benevolently dictating how we were going to respond to this pandemic, how we were going to connect, how we were going to move forward. And it seemed to be a leadership style that helped kind of lower the anxiety in the system. So I guess that's what I would say about the setting direction and the benevolent dictatorship piece of it.
Diana, you work a lot with clergy, and what have you noticed as both being a challenge within the frame of this model, but also an opportunity for clergy as they develop?
Yeah, I think that I'm grateful, Anna, that you had that experience of not too much resistance and sabotage. I've been hearing a lot of really complicated stories as parishioners are not necessarily, and members of communities are not necessarily bringing their best selves to the situation, right? There's so much anxiety out there, and people are really unsettled and have lost their basic infrastructure that allows them to be self-regulated in many cases. And so even if there's sort of that whole idea of displacement, right? They're really mad at the president, or they're really mad at the bishop for closing, the churches, but they're coming to their priest as a way to kind of dump that anxiety, right? And so they're really angry that the church is closed, or they're really angry that they can't do outreach in the same way that they used to be. So anyway, the way I've been using this in my practice is trying to helping people realize that managing sabotage and resistance is about that internal work of staying self-regulated in the face of someone else's anxiety that really has nothing to do with you. And in normal times, they maybe wouldn't even be reacting this way, right? So it's that process of the model is a circle, right? So you're managing sabotage and resistance. And so it's not about you, and it's learning not to take it personally, but it's also staying connected with the person that's reacting to you, and maintaining that relationship and trying to think about what's there. I think that when you are experiencing sabotage and resistance, sometimes it's really solely about the other person, but it is kind of an interesting moment to also gather data about your system. And maybe there's something in, there's something in what is it you're experiencing that teaches you about how your parishioners are experiencing this, about how your leadership team is experiencing it, how staff is experiencing it. And I will say, it's not just the rector or vicar that's taking the pressure. Sometimes it's also maybe the senior warden or the head of a given ministry of some kind, or a staff person that's sort of leading some piece of family ministry or something like that. So yeah.
I know when I have taught this model, either in college sessions or with clergy only, we talk a lot about how anxiety is an energy source. That it's anxiety is in some ways it's energy that's neutral in its morality, right? It can work for you, it can work against you. I think one of the challenges that I've found is that differentiating anxiety in this world post-quarantine is difficult, because everything that used to be separate and naturally boundaried is collapsed, right? So I don't have the clear boundaries anymore between my work life and my home life and my recreational life, which doesn't exist in the same way anymore. And so I'm wondering, Anna, if you could talk a little bit about how you are using this model to make decisions about boundaries and anxiety management as a leader.
Sure. So I think like what you said about anxiety being a source of energy is true. And I think a lot of us kind of hit the ground running when this first hit, whenever it hit, and worked probably too hard or kind of 24/7 for a number of days or weeks to kind of come up with a whole new system. And I think most of us need to kind of recognize we did a pretty good job of that. It's probably not perfect. But I think we've also, I've certainly recognized that there's a pace that I started this race at that I cannot sustain if we are going to keep on this journey until fall or until whenever. And so I think most of us are probably at a stage where we need to kind of slow down and recognize that this is a longer race than perhaps we thought, and be a bit compassionate with ourselves. And then I think that is a big problem for a lot of people, that we've lost the boundaries. When you work at home, you don't ever stop. And those of us like Alissa and I, who are also homeschooling and parenting through this, I know some people are actually, like myself and Alissa, are busier than we were before all of this. We don't have any more time, we actually have less time. And there's ways that we're going to need to create boundaries with time in a way that we maybe can't with space, because we're always at home. And so knowing how to stop working and switch into family time, and knowing when to kind of check out and spend some time alone is also, I think, important. Some people are really lonely in these times. I live with 5 other people. I really look forward to being lonely one day, but I'm not, right? So people are experiencing this differently. Some people are getting way too much alone time, and some people aren't getting enough. And I think we need to recognize that. So that it is all about differentiation, but I think for us right now, it's a challenge of differentiating the times of our days and our weeks.
I think this whole thing has led us to, I feel like part of the importance of self-differentiation is a moment of reflection. And I think you're totally right, Anna, that we're moving from that sort of crisis mode into chronic mode here. And so I think the opportunity for reflection is thinking about, what's the infrastructure of my life, and now I have a whole new life, right? So we have this moment of opportunity to think about what is the infrastructure of our life that allows us to remain self-differentiated, that allows us to think about anxiety and how it can give us energy rather than knocking us off our block.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has worked well for me in reflecting on this model is realizing that I behave differently within the frame of the model under extreme stress than I do when I feel spacious and relaxed about my ability to lead. And that for me, it's been a lot of reactivity, and moving into a more intentional space of trying to understand what's going on with me, where my anxiety and stress ends and the anxiety and stress of my system and my congregation begins, helps both of those anxieties become useful instead of detrimental, in terms of energy and moving forward. I know we had a great talk yesterday, the three of us, around the word self-care and how much we hate it. And how impossible it feels to put self-care out there as a task. But we had some productive conversation about other ways to think about managing our boundaries and our differentiation. And I invite either one of you to talk a little bit about that in terms of cultivating a non-anxious presence.
I think it's such an individual journey, right? You have to figure out for yourself, what do you need to do to move into not using the word self-care, because it's not actually a helpful concept right now. But there are things that you can do, that one does, to move back into that connected, self-differentiated place, right? We all lose it. Everybody does, right? And especially, if you're like every other human being on the planet right now, we all have higher levels of anxiety, and we have grief, and we have, all this stuff going on. So I think it's not really about self-care. It's about trying to figure out, what is it, given my context, my environment, that I need to do to move myself to sort of increase my sense of self-regulation and to move out of reactive into non-reactive mode. And I don't know, Anna, I don't know if you want to tell that story, but I think sometimes it's outside people that need to help us do that, right? There are other people in our lives who maybe have the job of noticing that we've gone off the rails for a little bit.
And so yesterday morning, I'm the chair of a board of a nonprofit, and I've been having some conflict with the staff person, because I think we're both kind of a bit off the rails, and the anxiety is high, and we're trying to figure out how to do this nonprofit's work in a new way. So we were having some conflict yesterday, and my husband kind of saw me at the dining room table, getting ready to send another email, and kind of told me to just walk away. And that was really helpful, to have someone telling me, like, don't give this any more energy today, like, just walk away from this. This problem will still be here tomorrow. He knows the other person I'm in conflict with. He says, like, both you and Ryan just need to calm down and come back at this tomorrow. And I was really grateful for that, and he was absolutely right. And later on, Ryan and I had a lovely conversation while I was sitting on my front step, and the world got a whole lot better. So who are the people in your life who can kind of help you see what's going on with you and help you sort out, like, when you need to walk away? I did the there's if you still have your binder or whatever it is, there is that self-regulation survey that you do it again, because like Alissa was saying, I think the answers that we give are probably different given our current situation. So if you've circled your answers from before, like, notice how they may have changed. I know I'm not as self-regulated as I usually am, and I think just sort of recognizing that and being honest about that is part of the journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, go ahead, Susan. What you got?
We've had a question from Keith Patterson. Is there any understanding that what some people may be feeling is actually grief and or trauma?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think all of us are in some stage of grief or trauma, and it really varies from situation to situation. I think through the frame of this model, I would understand those as potential sources of anxiety. I know that my spouse is a respiratory therapist at a major hospital in Seattle, and my experience of residual grief and trauma from what he is going through was a huge source of anxiety for me the first couple of weeks that this was really happening, and did mess with my ability to self-regulate and my ability to understand, in a clear way where my reactions were coming from. And so I think I also saw a really great comment from Patricia that we've also lost a lot of nonverbal cues and messages from other people. And so I think another dynamic that's at play, perhaps that would fit well into the sabotage and resistance part of this model, is that people are behaving, people have always misbehaved on the internet in ways they never would have misbehaved in person. It's just easier, and now this is a primary mode of communication and of community building for a lot of folks. So even here, where you can see my face and catch some nonverbal cues from me, it's not the same as being in the room with each other. And so there's that makes some of the work of leadership and differentiation lonelier, because we can't be in the same space as the people that we're leading.
Yeah, can I say something about that too,
Yeah,
Alissa?
yeah,
Yeah, so I feel like the piece here about, to me, the piece here that's the most important is that idea of reflecting and stepping back and trying to hold for in your own self, right? You have your very reactive self, you have your very non-reactive self. And so you're having less, recognizing as you go into those conversations that you have less data than you usually do, that people are acting differently than they usually do, that the way that you would normally tailor and moderate your response to other people might not work in the same way that it has before, right? And so I feel like the bigger picture here, I just keep coming back to reflection, right? That idea of getting back up on the balcony. And if you think about an old-fashioned dance hall, there's the dancers on the floor and you're one of those dancers and you're up on the balcony, looking and understanding the patterns that are down there, and seeing how you're reacting and how others are reacting, super informed by grief and trauma, super informed by unusual behavior. All those things seems really important to me.
Yeah, wonderful. Can I just say how happy it makes me to see everyone putting page numbers up for where to find that.
The other thing we talked about yesterday was about the connect part of the model. And I think a lot of us, when this first hit the ground, figured out ways for our communities to continue to connect with one another. With Sunday worship, and a lot of us put our congregations in pods or in home groups or started phone trees, and we did all of that. I would say this model suggests to me that we need to kind of keep that work going, but also we need to think about connecting to the wider community in different ways, and paying attention and helping our people connect to the wider community. There's some pretty crazy stuff going on right now. I know in Calgary, the fact that the US border is closed means that there's not enough street drugs in Calgary. So we have a whole bunch of people detoxing who weren't really planning to detox. We have increased violence because people don't have access to the drugs. We have huge challenges in the Filipino community right now because a lot of them work in long-term care homes as well as meat processing plants. And we have a large Anglican Filipino community, and there's huge stresses in that community right now. So how our congregation has been helping collect computers to give to families who are trying to homeschool without adequate access to technology. So I think as we shift out of kind of immediate reaction to what's going on in our immediate kind of circle, I would encourage you to think about the connect part of the model maybe wider than you've thought about it at first. And how can you connect to kind of the wider stresses in the community, which you probably have some examples of in your community, but also how do our congregations respond to some of the really big challenges going on in our community right now? I don't know if anyone has anything to say about that.
Well, I think that one of the things, we had a question come up about setting direction, and what's coming up for me is how closely related those two are, that we enable our communities to be connected, right, to become leaders. So if your congregation is connected to what's going on, us as leaders, our job is to set direction for them within that, right? So this is what we're gonna do, for my congregation, one of the things that we immediately prioritized was taking care of our neighbors. And so keeping our food bank open, keeping our homeless shelter open. That took some direction setting from leadership around who could volunteer, around, I had to immediately tell some people who were used to being volunteers in those ministries that they weren't allowed to do that anymore, which is much more directive than I prefer to be with my congregation. And so there is a lot of back and forth, I think, between those two things, between being able to stay connected and enable your community to be connected, and our ability as leaders to set appropriate and safe direction kind of right out of the gate, right off the bat. So we're at time. Thank you so much, Anna and Diana, for being part of this conversation. We are going to be, we're recording the session, and we're also going to be saving the chat. And so all of this is recoverable, reviewable, revisitable information.